and welcome to Economics in One Lesson in the 21st Century, where I'll be showing you a straightforward way to judge for yourself what other people are saying about economics. By learning a single, simple economic lesson, you'll be able to work out your own answers to important questions like these. Should banks have been bailed out in 2008? Did stimulating the economy help everyone? Would it really be a good idea for the government to pay some people to dig holes in the ground and others to fill them in again? Is saving really bad for the economy, like many economists believe? Is deflation, when things cost less over time, really so terrible? If one person becomes richer, does that mean that someone else has become poorer? Do government deficits matter? And should we just wipe out all debts and start again? It's important to remember a couple of things when economics is discussed. First, economics can be very complicated, especially the way it's usually taught. Intelligent people can and do make mistakes which lead them to wrong conclusions. And second, some people might be arguing for what benefits them personally rather than what is true or fair. The one lesson will protect you from both of these problems because it's easy to understand and, as I think you'll see, obviously correct. Better still, the only maths you need is addition and subtraction. The one lesson will let you judge for yourself what the apparent experts in the media are claiming. So the next time you hear a politician or pundit say that everyone would be better off if the government just gave each person £1,000 of newly printed money, the one lesson will show you exactly what it is they aren't telling you. What you won't get here is a school or university course on economics. There won't be anything on production functions, marginal propensity to consume, price elasticity of demand, IS and LM curves and so on, but that's okay because most people don't actually need it. What you will get is a really good overview of economics, better than a lot of people who study the details but don't see the wood for the trees have. If you're an economics student or professional, you'll probably find that the one lesson challenges at least some of your most deeply held beliefs. I hope it encourages you to question them, although I realise that if you're over 30, Keynes considered you a lost cause. So, what is this one lesson? It's just this. To understand economics, look at how each decision or action affects each person's net worth. Pretty simple perhaps, but I promise it will lead us to some very interesting conclusions, some of which are at odds with what many economists believe. I'll use the rest of this video to explain the lesson fully. For example, what exactly do I mean by a person's net worth, and how does it change? In future videos, I'll show you how to apply the lesson to questions like the ones that I asked at the start, and to lots of other topics in economics. Before I do that, I'd just like to say where the idea for this approach to economics came from. The one lesson is based on that of American newspaper columnist and author Henry Hazlitt, from his 1946 book Economics in One Lesson. He presented one simple but profound economic lesson and gave lots of examples of applying it. This channel follows the same pattern. Hazlitt wanted to protect his readers from groups who were lobbying the government to make policies which benefited them, and who were trying to fool the public into believing that they would benefit too. He basically emphasised the common sense idea that there is no such thing as a free lunch. I think it's a great book, and if you get a chance I recommend reading it, but I'll show you in a future video why I think this new one lesson has some advantages over Hazlitt's. So, going back to the one lesson, what exactly is net worth? It's just what you own, plus what other people owe to you, minus what you owe to other people. In other words, it's what you'd be left with if everyone paid their debts. Here's an example. Bob owns a house and a car. He's owed £50 by Alice, who borrowed that much from him last week. Bob's green token and the similar pink token held by Alice together represent a single debt of £50. Bob still owes £150,000 of a mortgage to Megabank, and also owes a bag of sugar to his neighbour Charlotte, who lent him one the previous day. Bob has two pink tokens, and Megabank and Charlotte have corresponding green tokens, altogether representing these two debts. The house and the car are called tangible assets, literally things which can be touched. I'll call the £50 owed to Bob a debt asset. At some point in the future, Alice will give him £50, and all he has to do in return is agree that she doesn't owe the debt anymore. Someone who has a debt asset is called a creditor. The £150,000 and the bag of sugar which he owes are called liabilities. At some point in the future, he will have to give these things to Megabank and Charlotte, and again, all they have to do in return is agree that he doesn't owe these debts anymore. Someone who has a liability is called a debtor. So Bob is both a creditor and a debtor. Using this terminology, net worth is tangible assets plus debt assets minus liabilities. In Bob's case, his net worth is his house plus his car plus £50 minus £150,000 minus the bag of sugar. Because he's owed something of the same kind that he owes, the money, we can simplify this to his house plus his car minus £149,950 minus the bag of sugar. At this point, any accountants watching are probably itching to assign a money value to each of these assets and liabilities, based either on how much they cost originally or on how much they would cost to replace. This would let us state his net worth as a single value, say £55,049. But for the one lesson, we won't do this. In economics, it's important to remember the difference between a thing and how much money it costs. After all, even if you have all the money in the world, you can only eat if someone is prepared to swap food for some of it. We can show assets, liabilities, and net worth in a two-column table called a balance sheet. One column is for assets, and the other for liabilities. It's called a balance sheet because if you put net worth with the liabilities, the two columns have the same total. The total itself is actually not that interesting. It's the net worth you want to concentrate on. Every person has their own balance sheet. Are there any other balance sheets around? In fact, there are. Every corporation has its own balance sheet and net worth, completely separate from those of real people. Some common types of corporation are limited companies, charities, and governments. In a later video, we'll look at the idea of a balance sheet for nature, but for now, we'll only look at assets and liabilities which appear on a real person's or a corporation's balance sheet. From now on, when I just say person, I mean either a real person or a corporation. People's balance sheets change over time, but before we look at how that happens, it's worth spending a minute looking at the idea of a balance sheet for a group of people. We can imagine that all of the people's tangible assets, debt assets, and liabilities are put together on a single balance sheet. A fairly simple bit of maths shows that the net worth of the group is just the sum of the net worths of the members of the group. Leave a note in the comments if you want me to explain it. A word of caution about a group's net worth: it only tells us the total wealth of the group, not how it's distributed between its members. A wealthy family can have a member who is extremely poor, for example. Sometimes one member of a group might owe a debt to another member. In this case, the debt asset increases a group's net worth by exactly as much as a liability decreases it. So a debt owed by one member of a group to another has no effect on the net worth of the whole group. But don't forget that it still affects the individual net worths of the creditor and the debtor. A group can be as big as you like, so let's imagine the whole world's balance sheet. Every debt owed by someone in the world is owed to someone in the world, and vice versa. So all the debt assets and all the liabilities cancel each other out, which means that the net worth of the whole world is just the sum of all the tangible assets owned by someone. Always bear this in mind when someone suggests an apparently effortless way to make everyone better off. If the quantity of tangible assets stays the same, then one group can only increase its net worth if the rest of the world's net worth decreases by exactly the same amount. Since all people's net worths add up to the whole world's net worth, we can think of an individual's net worth as their share of the whole world's net worth. So far, we've looked at net worth at a single point in time, but over time, a person's net worth changes as entries are added to or removed from their balance sheet. This is the last major part needed to understand the one lesson. It turns out that no matter how complicated an economic scenario is, it can be broken down into a number of extremely simple economic actions, as I'll call them, and there are exactly 8 different types of action. The great thing about looking at economics this way is that we can easily understand the whole scenario just by looking at the individual actions. Alice, Bob and Charlotte will illustrate each of the types of action. For each type, we'll see 2 diagrams. First, we'll see how each person's balance sheet changes, and then we'll see what I call a net worth diagram, which uses arrows between the people to summarise the effects of the action. As far as I know, net worth diagrams are unique to the one lesson, and they help to make economics very easy to understand. Just for simplicity, the scenario mostly involves apples, and isn't very realistic either, but that's because the point of it is to illustrate the effects of the different types of action. The first type of action we'll look at is production. Here, Alice harvests an apple by plucking it from a tree in her garden. First, watch how her balance sheet changes as she gets a new tangible asset, the apple, and her net worth increases by 1 apple. Instead of showing Alice's whole balance sheet, a net worth diagram just shows the changes, which makes the action much easier to understand. Here, an arrow goes to Alice, showing that her net worth increases by the apple next to the arrow. If someone else had the apple before, the arrow would come from them, but because nobody did, the arrow comes from the symbol, which basically means nothingness. What this shows is that nobody else's net worth changes when Alice's net worth increases by the apple. The colour of the arrow means something too. Purple represents a tangible asset, and white represents nothingness, so the colour gradient from white to purple also shows that the apple comes from production and not from someone else. This shows that production increases a person's net worth by the thing produced, and nobody else's net worth is affected. By the way, this answers one of the questions at the beginning of the video. It is possible for someone to become richer without anyone else becoming poorer. Production is where all tangible assets come from. It normally requires effort and sacrifice to produce something. That could be as simple as taking the time and effort to go to a tree and pluck an apple, or it could involve other economic actions which, as we'll see, reduce the producer's net worth, like paying employees and using up raw materials when manufacturing cars, say. The second type of action is transfer of a tangible asset. Now that Alice has an apple, she decides to give it to Bob. Watch how the apple moves from Alice's balance sheet to Bob's, and how their net worths change. Alice's net worth decreases by 1 apple, and Bob's net worth increases by 1 apple. So we can say that 1 apple of net worth has been transferred from Alice to Bob. The net worth diagram for this action shows this transfer of 1 apple of net worth. The purple arrow shows that it is a tangible asset which is being used to transfer the net worth. By itself, this looks like Alice is giving Bob an apple as a gift. What if Alice is actually giving Bob an apple in exchange for a banana? Well, that's just a slightly more complicated scenario with 2 transfers of tangible assets. The effect on everyone's net worth of a transaction like this is exactly the same as a combined effect of the individual actions. Alice's net worth would decrease by 1 apple and increase by 1 banana, and Bob's net worth would increase by 1 apple and decrease by 1 banana. The third type of action is consumption. Bob has an apple and he decides to eat it. Again, look at the changes to Bob's balance sheet. He no longer has one of his tangible assets, the apple, and his net worth decreases by 1 apple. The net worth diagram just shows an arrow going from Bob to the nothingness symbol. Bob's net worth decreases by 1 apple and nobody else's net worth changes. The purple to white arrow shows that the apple is being consumed. So, consumption decreases a person's net worth by the thing consumed, and nobody else's net worth is affected. Even though consumption reduces a person's net worth, there are good reasons for doing it. Some consumption is needed just to stay alive, and other consumption makes life easier or more pleasurable. And you often need to consume raw materials when you produce something. If Bob wants to produce a cake, he has to consume flour, eggs, butter and sugar in the process. Again, we can treat this as a transaction with several individual economic actions. Unfortunately, consumption sometimes happens without the consumer getting any benefit, like if Bob drops and smashes his mobile phone. It's worth pointing out that consumption doesn't always happen in a very short time, like an apple. It can be over many years, like a car. We'll deal with that detail in a later video. Always remember that you can only consume something if someone has actually produced it. It sounds obvious, but watch out for arguments which rely on there being some magic way to get around it, usually involving borrowing. The fourth type of action is providing a service. Suppose Alice washes Bob's car for him. It doesn't actually affect anyone's balance sheet, but services are an important part of economics. Even though nobody's net worth is changed, Alice is putting in the effort and Bob is benefiting from it. 19th century French economist Jean-Baptiste Say pointed out that providing a service is like the simultaneous production, transfer and consumption of an immaterial product. Today we'd probably say a virtual product. The person providing the service has to apply their skill and effort, but it's the person who uses the service who benefits. Just like if Alice picks an apple and gives it straight to Bob, who immediately eats it. Using this idea, we could represent providing a service in a net worth diagram like this. But it's simpler not to show the virtual production and consumption at all, and just show the transfer like this. With just these four types of action, we can show any scenario in a barter economy where goods and services are produced, consumed, and transferred or exchanged for each other. The only difference with a complex modern economy is that there are debts, which means that we need four more types of economic action. Action type 5 is the creation of a new debt. Here, Alice makes a legally binding commitment to give Bob an apple tomorrow. If she fails, Bob can take Alice to a court to force her to keep her promise. So Alice will end up with one less apple, and Bob will end up with one more apple. Watch how their balance sheets change as Alice gets a new liability of one apple, Bob gets a new debt asset of one apple. Alice's net worth decreases by one apple, and Bob's net worth increases by one apple. Just like actually transferring an apple, Alice's commitment to transfer an apple to Bob tomorrow immediately decreases her net worth by one apple and increases Bob's net worth by one apple. So it's also a transfer of one apple of net worth from Alice to Bob. The arrow for this action has a colour gradient from pink to green, showing that net worth is transferred from the new debtor to the new creditor. This action is where all debt assets and liabilities come from. They're always created in pairs. You can't have a debt which is owed to someone but not owed by someone, or vice versa, even though some economists, who should know better, like to believe that you can. Usually, a debt is created as part of a transaction involving another action where the new debtor receives something in exchange. By the way, debts aren't just for tangible assets. For example, if you pay someone to wash your car, they are in debt to you. What they owe you is the performance of that service. Action type 6 is transfer of a debt asset. Because Alice owes Bob an apple, Bob can give the debt asset to Charlotte, so that Alice now owes an apple to Charlotte instead. Watch how their balance sheets change as the debt asset moves from Bob's balance sheet to Charlotte's. Bob's net worth decreases by one apple, and Charlotte's net worth increases by one apple. Alice's balance sheet doesn't change. She still owes an apple, just to Charlotte instead of Bob. Because Bob's net worth decreases by one apple and Charlotte's increases by one apple, the net worth diagram has an arrow showing the transfer of one apple of net worth from Bob to Charlotte. The arrow is green to show that the net worth is being transferred by transferring a debt asset. Usually, a transfer of a debt asset is in exchange for another action which transfers net worth in the other direction. By the way, we'll see later why this is a type of economic action which describes transfers of money. Action type 7 is transfer of a liability, which is probably the least common type. Here, Alice owes Charlotte an apple, and Bob agrees that he will now owe the debt instead of Alice. As the liability moves from Alice's balance sheet to Bob's, notice that Alice's net worth increases by one apple, and Bob's net worth decreases by one apple. Charlotte is still owed the apple, so her net worth doesn't change. Because Alice's net worth increases by 1 apple and Bob's decreases by 1 apple, the net worth diagram has an arrow showing the transfer of 1 apple of net worth from Bob to Alice. Notice that this is the opposite direction to the transfer of the liability, because the liability decreases the net worth of the person who has it. The arrow is pink to show that net worth is transferred by transferring a liability. Usually, someone taking over another person's liability receives a transfer of net worth in exchange, but again, that's a separate action. The final type of action is write-off of a debt. Charlotte agrees that Bob no longer owes her an apple. As we'll see on their balance sheets, Bob's liability of 1 apple disappears, Charlotte's debt asset of 1 apple disappears, Bob's net worth increases by 1 apple, and Charlotte's net worth decreases by 1 apple. This is a transfer of 1 apple of net worth from Charlotte to Bob. The arrow for this action has a colour gradient from green to pink, the opposite way to the creation of a new debt, because net worth is being transferred from the creditor to the debtor. Just like debt assets and liabilities are always created in pairs, they also get destroyed in pairs, because it doesn't make sense to have a one-sided debt. Usually, a person writes off a debt as part of a transaction where the debtor gives the creditor what was promised, again as a separate action. So, those are the 8 types of economic action, and any scenario, including the whole economy over a period of centuries or millennia, can be described as a set of actions of these types. Admittedly, there are unimaginably vast numbers of actions, but there are 2 huge advantages to thinking about the economy this way. First, it's very simple. Each action is easy to understand. Production adds the produced tangible asset to a person's net worth. Consumption subtracts the consumed tangible asset from a person's net worth. 5 of the action types just transfer some of one person's net worth to another person, and a service has no effect on anyone's net worth. And second, it's very easy to work out the effects of a group of actions. You just add up the effects of the individual actions. So, if Alice gives Bob an apple, and Bob promises to give Charlotte an apple tomorrow in exchange for a banana today, then Alice's net worth has decreased by 1 apple, Bob's net worth has increased by 1 banana, and Charlotte's net worth has increased by 1 apple minus 1 banana. Because we can just add up the effects of actions, we can work out the effects of all actions since the beginning of time on the whole world's net worth. Every production action added the produced tangible asset to the world's net worth. Every consumption action subtracted the consumed tangible asset from the world's net worth. Every other action left the world's net worth unchanged. So the world's current net worth is just everything which has ever been produced minus everything which has ever been consumed. In other words, all existing tangible assets, which agrees with what we saw when we looked at the group balance sheet for the whole world. So we've now seen all we need to understand how the whole economy works, and it's like this. First, production. People produce tangible assets, which increases their net worth, but requires effort. Second, distribution. Some of a person's net worth can be transferred to another person. This could be in exchange for some of the other person's net worth. It could be a gift to the other person, or it could be taken by force or fraud by the other person. The net worth can be transferred in any of several ways: transferring a tangible asset, creating a new debt, transferring a debt asset, transferring a liability, or writing off a debt. Finally, consumption. People can consume their tangible assets, which decreases their net worth, but generally benefits them. This also covers services. We just need to think of providing a service as the production, transfer, and consumption of a virtual tangible asset. You can think of a person's net worth as their savings, what they would have left over after paying the debts they owe. Since this is what they have for consuming, trading, giving, or having taken from them, it's important that they don't run out of net worth. In a future video, we'll look at the trouble it causes if they do. Here are two quick examples to finish with. Example 1 is in a bookshop. A customer buys a book for £10 using cash. There are two actions. The customer transfers £10 of cash to the bookshop, and the bookshop transfers the book to the customer. Cash is actually a debt asset, where the central bank is the debtor. I'll talk about this more in a later video on money. The customer's net worth increases by the book and decreases by £10, and the bookshop's net worth increases by £10 and decreases by the book. So their combined net worth is unchanged by the transaction. This is what we'd expect, because there's no production or consumption. Nobody else's net worth changes, so the whole world's net worth is unchanged. The customer and the shop have just exchanged part of their net worth for a part of the other's net worth which they'd rather have. Example 2 is quantitative easing, QE for short. It might sound complicated, but the one lesson makes it easy to understand. All you need to know first is what a government bond is. Suppose a government wants to borrow £1 million. A person, perhaps an insurance company, decides to lend the money and transfers £1 million, a debt asset, to the government. In exchange, the government promises to repay the insurer the £1 million in, say, 5 years' time. It also promises to pay some interest, say £20,000 per year, in the meantime. This small collection of new debts, which are due to be paid on different dates in the future, is called a bond. QE is where a central bank buys a government bond from the insurer with some new money. The central bank creates a new debt owed to the insurer, perhaps £1.2 million, and the insurer transfers the bond, a debt asset, to the central bank. The new debt owed by the central bank is in the form of cash or the electronic equivalent. And that's all it is. The insurance company's net worth increases by £1.2 million and decreases by the bond, and the central bank's net worth increases by the bond and decreases by £1.2 million. The combined net worth is unchanged by the transaction. Again, this is what we'd expect, because there's no production or consumption. Nobody else's net worth changes, so the whole world's net worth is unchanged. Why would we expect QE to make everyone better off? As we've seen, it's only production which adds to the world's net worth. Even if QE somehow indirectly encourages people to produce more, it's those people's effort and production which makes the world better off, not the creation of the new money. One thing which QE almost certainly will do is change how the world's net worth ends up being distributed between people. And remember that if any group's net worth increases as a result of QE, that means that the rest of the world's net worth must decrease by exactly the same amount. Ponder on that. Okay, thanks for watching. If you appreciated this video, please share, like and subscribe. Also, please leave any comments below. I'll be making more videos using the one lesson to analyse lots of different scenarios and answer lots of questions so you can get a better understanding of what's going on in the economy. I'll see you soon for more economics in one lesson in the 21st century.